So let me introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. David G. Myers of Hope College. Dave is the author of the most successful series of introductory psychology textbooks on the planet. He is the recipient of multiple awards and honorary doctorates, but we teachers know him best as a passionate and tireless advocate for the teaching of psychology. He founded the David and Carol Myers Foundation, which supports a range of psychological and humanitarian causes. He's made generous gifts to both APA and APS in support of teaching. Dave is not just a researcher and teacher, but he's also an advocate, working to change public accommodations for people with hearing loss. Dave produces a weekly talk site blog in which he analyzes current events through the lens of psychology. It is always worth reading for both teachers and students. We appreciate Macmillan Publishing for sponsoring him to speak with us today on life in the time of COVID, psychology's insights and tips. Dave?
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you for taking over the nighttop reins from Doug Bernstein. And thank you to the organizing committee on behalf of all of us who are on this call, arranging this special meeting this year. And I can't resist also saying just a word on behalf of Nighttop. Those of us who have been privileged to attend the Florida Nighttop gatherings have found them a wonderful opportunity to network, to gather ideas from kindred spirits, to form friendships. In my experience, the nicest, kindest people in psychology are those who prioritize making time for their commitment to their students and trying to take that to a new level. And that includes today, everybody who's on this call, who's taking time out from a winter holiday or other activities to join us. So I tip my hat to each one of you for being here, for caring about teaching, for caring about your students. So Stephen has invited me to reflect on the pandemic and what psychology might have to offer in terms of both insights and some of the practical advice to which he was just referring. And just to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to do in the next 25 or 30 minutes that Stephen has graciously given me is first look at some indicators of mental health during the pandemic and how this illustrates our human need to belong. And there's some interesting age-related trends associated with mental health. And I'm also going to offer you a long-term upbeat perspective on this kind of down era that we're in. And then I want to step back and ask, how are we feeling about and how are we fearing during this time? And there's some dynamics that drive some people to fear too little and others to fear too much. And we'll look at those. And then I want to look at some of the challenges that Stephen just referred to for psychology teachers to address. So let's start with the need to belong. Of course, Maslow had it in his hierarchy as one of the basic human needs. And our need to belong is certainly validated by all the research that shows that we are social animals. We thrive, we flourish in close relationships when experiencing social support. That's conducive to happiness and health and well-being. And indeed, the virus has fed on our need to belong and to come together. We also, when deprived of that need, when separated or when ostracized especially, feel deep pain, and it's real pain. And thus, people are having to cope and are challenged to cope with this threat to the need to belong. For some, this means the stress of added work at home while also parenting children at the same time. I had a colleague of mine just talk about her kids who are both working full-time from home and managing 3 kids, and it's just a terrible stress. For others, there's isolation, there's aloneness. Is that conducive to depression and even to ill health? Well, we had some early indicators from national surveys last spring that the virus was affecting the mental health of millions of people. And indeed, data has now accumulated. For example, Gallup has tracked life evaluations of Americans and found last spring a dramatic plunge in the self-reported well-being of Americans. The percentage of Americans who said they were worried, normally a very stable upper 30s number, juiced up to into the mid 40s and above. The Census Bureau has reported that 1/3 of Americans are showing signs of clinical anxiety or depression. And this affects all kinds of people, including people who live relatively privileged lives. Michelle Obama reported quarantine-related low-grade depression last August. And it's not just in the United States. In the UK, too, the Lancet reports mental health has deteriorated during the social isolation imposed by the pandemic. And cartoonists are recognizing this. Boy, time sure flies when every day is joyless and exactly the same as every other day. So that's the first kind of conclusion, is there's been a really kind of dramatic, substantial mental health effect of the pandemic. Second interesting point is, however, surprising age variations in the extent to which that is true. This first appeared in some national surveys asking people whether they felt lonely or isolated in the last week. And as you can see, there's a rather dramatic increase in the percentage of people reporting feeling isolated or lonely as they grow, as they are younger. So that's especially true for 18 to 29-year-olds. Gallup has found the same thing. Younger Americans are having less tolerance for confinement under the pandemic. Here's a national survey that Jean Twenge and Tom Joyner repeated, doing it in 2018 and again in 2020, identifying the percentage of Americans who report serious mental distress. And as you can see, in 2018, in every age group, it's about 4% of people. But whoa, look at 2020, 38% of 18 to 29-year-olds, though only 9% of 60 and older are reporting serious mental distress. Or look at CDC data on suicide ideation. And as you can see here, some 26% of 18 to 24-year-olds, that's triple the usual number, reported having suicidal thoughts in late June. These are just dramatic increases. And so it takes us, I think, to two big lessons or conclusions we can draw from this. One, there has been a massive mental health consequence. And to me, it's a surprise. From early 2021, it's easy to have, if you can pardon the pun, 2020 hindsight and think, well, of course, it should have been this way. But I don't think it's what I would have predicted. I think I've been so convinced by research on behavior genetics, think of the separated twin studies, for example, that our dispositions and our vulnerability to depression are so biologically fixed and our capacity for resilience is so great that merely being confined in one's house, which is certainly not the most toxic or traumatic of circumstances, would not have a great effect on mental health, but it has. And so that reminds me, as if I should have needed reminding as a social psychologist, of the power of the situation. Secondly, the age differences are a surprise to me. I would have guessed, would you have guessed too, that younger adults be more adept at social media with all the connections that entails might have been less vulnerable than isolated older adults. But in fact, it's been the opposite. And indeed, that now takes us back to thinking about the priority of relationships and of peer relationships for teens and young adults. Older adults have a smaller network of social relationships, which are simply less important than they are to younger adults. There is an exception, though, an apparent exception at least. In another one of her national surveys, Jean Twenge found that surprisingly, teens, pre-college teens, are doing surprisingly well. If you compare 2018 to 2020 national teen surveys, their mental health hasn't suffered. So why is that? They're suffering the effects of isolation and reduced face-to-face contact. You got any ideas as to why they're doing relatively well? They came up with two answers. One is sleep. Sleep loss is a huge emotional burden for adolescents. And in 2018, only 55% of teens were sleeping 7 or more hours a night. 2020, when so many last spring were having to get up to go to school, 84% were having a good night's sleep. That's big. And secondly, family relationships. 56% of teens were spending more time talking with their parents. 54% said their family now ate dinner together more often. 68% said their families had become closer during the pandemic, which has led to some internet memes like, my internet was down for 5 minutes, so I went downstairs and spoke to my family. Hey, they seem like nice people. So That's an exception, although we do have some other data is a little more complicated. If you look at it a different way, the CDC reports that mental health visits for that small slice of teens that are seeking out mental health services has not been stable. It's actually gone up a little bit. So this is a little ambiguity here. But by and large, it's been a lousy year. 2020 was really not good. And everybody seemingly was feeling, or most everybody, a certain amount of angst. Among progressives, they're looking at the future of the Supreme Court, a president that seems to foment racism and reject science and threaten our democracy. Conservatives are demoralized by the president's failed reelection and by the nation becoming increasingly diverse, secular, and progressive. And everybody who, regardless of your politics, are feeling the effects of the pandemic and are weary of the tribal politics here in the United States in particular. And this is also borne out in national surveys. In September, Gallup reported that 85% of Americans were dissatisfied with the way things are going. And we have various popular images of that: doom scrolling, binging on bad news, or good night moon, good night Zoom, good night impending sense of doom. It's a pretty darn depressive world right now. It was an awful year, 2020, really it was. And so in the midst of that, I want to just have a, if you'll pardon me, I tend to be a Pollyannish optimist, offer a little bit of long-term perspective on this. This was a bad year, but it's a bad year amid an overall improvement in our human fortunes over time. And you can see this, by the way, if you want to be uplifted, if you're on Twitter, just sign on to Beautiful News Daily, and once a day you'll get some good news fact about the world, like female youth literacy and globally is steadily marching upward. Steven Pinker has written about the kind of upward march of humanity in his 2 recent books, discussing the decline of violence, the increase in literacy, the increase in life expectancy. The list goes on and on and on. And Hans Rosling, in his book Factfulness, little book that just is loaded with information that compares what people perceive is reality in the world to what is actually the case. And just to give you a little glimpse, bad things of so many kinds are diminishing more than people expect. Slavery is down, child labor, world hunger, the death penalty, you name it, the cost of alternative energy, it's all plummeting. All these bad things are decreasing. And all kinds of good things are increasing. Girls in school, immunizations, literacy rates. The world is getting better and better in the long run. Climate change is the big threat for the future. But apart from that, once the pandemic ends, humanity over the last century has certainly been on an upward track, and that's good news to have in mind to balance the gloom and doom of the present. Okay, that's a little look at back at 2020. Second thing, and a little bit more briefly, is a look at people's fears, which sometimes are too little and sometimes too much concerning the pandemic. Some folks are prone to fear too little, to experience what we know as unrealistic optimism. We're natural positive thinkers, and thus college students, when asked to compare themselves to their college peers and how likely it is that they will later become alcoholic, be fired from a job, get cancer, you name any bad thing, the average college student thinks they're much less likely than their peers to experience that, be in an auto accident or whatever. Smokers understand that smoking is dangerous, but they think it's somewhat less threatening to them than it is to other smokers. Newlyweds understand that divorce often happens, but overwhelmingly, over 90% are confident that it's not going to happen to them, when in fact, to some of them it is. And thus, as a result of unrealistic optimism, people thinking it's not going to affect me, it's going to affect others, we have people flocking to bars and restaurants and to various super spreader events. And thus, here in the United States, we have, 5 times the COVID infection rate as is our population proportion relative to the world. On the other extreme, there are people that are fearing maybe a little too much. The New York Times had an article on parents who were afraid that their children might die if they went back to college where they might catch the virus. Look at these new data just released last week from the Gallup World Poll of more than 100,000 people in 58 countries. Who's worried about their health during the COVID crisis? 18 to 29-year-olds are just as afraid as people over 65. That's extraordinary, especially when you consider the reality. I did a little check from the CDC website. From February 1st to December 23rd, there were fewer than 600 COVID deaths to people under 25. That's a tragedy for each one of those 2,600 and for those who love them. I don't mean to diminish that for a moment, but their vulnerability to death from COVID is about what it is to seasonal flu, Johns Hopkins reports. Meanwhile, during that same normal time period of nearly 11 months, the number of people under 25 in the United States who would die in a vehicular accident is 10 times that number. So however afraid a under 25 person is of dying of COVID, they should be 10 times as afraid, if their fears align with reality, of dying in a vehicular accident. But that's not the way things are, because sometimes we fear too much, thanks, of course, to what we know as the availability heuristic, by which we estimate the likelihood of events by how readily they come to mind. And thus, vivid images of terrible things happening can hijack our thinking of bodies in morgues, of airplane crashes, or of riots, for example, or civil disturbances. There was just, again, last week, a national survey found that nearly half of Americans believe that the majority of protests this last summer were violent, when in fact an infinitesimal percentage of them were. But they were very vividly displayed and thus available in memory. And that has a way of hijacking our judgment, thanks to the availability heuristic. And that can lead then to exaggerated fears of all sorts of things that kill people visibly and in bunches, and are fearing too little things that kill people quietly out of sight without great publicity. Okay, we've looked at mental health during the pandemic and reflected on the human need to belong and seen some interesting age-related trends, albeit complemented by an upbeat perspective on humanity's long-term trends. We've looked at our fears, which sometimes are exaggerated and sometimes are underplayed. Last thing is what Stephen mentioned in his introduction, which is challenges that psychology has to address in this pandemic era. Some of them Stephen referred to in his opening, and these could be a talk in and of themselves. In fact, I have a talk on this, and that is applying our teaching of critical thinking to counter its conspiracy thinking, anti-vax thinking, disrespect for scientific expertise. That is certainly part of our mission, part of our opportunity, part of our challenge as teachers of psychological science. But I want to focus on a couple other things. One is this concept of what's been called intergenerational altruism. Can we as educators help foster this? Can we activate a new social responsibility norm that fosters intergenerational altruism? And what do I mean by that? Well, think about it this way. The COVID virus is something we need youth and young adults to be responsive to, if not for their own survival, then for the health of their surrounding communities. We need them not to spread the virus. We need them to do that for us, for all of us, on their campuses and in their families and on their communities. And I don't know about how it is with your school. In my school, the students have been great. We've been on campus, most students this semester. Everybody, 100% in my building, regardless of their politics, are masked. There's a strong norm. They're doing it, and they're protecting me and everybody and our surrounding community, and hats off to them. So the Scottish government has been very successful in promoting responsible behavior, and has this sign that's around Scotland: by wearing a face covering, you're protecting those around you. And that's a message, a social responsibility norm activation that we've given, and I think pretty successfully so, to our population, including young adults. But there's another problem that where the, if you will, the calculus is reversed. The threat is not of climate apocalypse in the future, is not to the young, it's not to the old, but to the young. Rising temperatures, rising seas, more extreme weather, hunger, migration, conflict, all these things that seem destined to plague humanity in the future are not particular problems for those over 70 who will be long gone by the time these problems reach their peak. Rather, it's a problem for today's 18 to 25-year-olds who are going to have to live with the consequences of the climate crisis created by their grandparents and parents. So what about it? Will we older folks, could we potentially reciprocate in our actions and with our voting with the same intergenerational altruism that younger adults and youth have shown to us by masking up and by isolating? They've done it for us. It seems to me one message potentially the incoming administration could convey to older Americans is we owe it to reciprocate that altruism back to youth and young adults in our actions and our votes and our priorities. Okay, last thing is, well, two more things and then I'm done. One is we need, of course, to create some strong social norms. We've done a pretty good job of this by applying principles of modeling. You may at first, when you masked up and went out in your community and not everybody was, felt kind of like creepy or weird, a little awkward. But now with the very strong norm that everybody wear masks and with the evidence that where people wear masks, as virtually everyone does in Hong Kong, for example, there is very little COVID. That's, by the way, true in the United States. Here's an interesting figure of data gathered by Carnegie Mellon University. Here we see for the 50 states, the percentage of people in each state who are wearing a mask most of the time, and the percentage of people in those states who know somebody with COVID symptoms. And as you can see, you're looking there at a minus 0.85 correlation, a great example of a negative correlation if you'd like one for your class. And by the way, I'm happy to make these slides available to anybody who would have any use for them afterwards. So we need to model appropriate behavior, protective behavior under the pandemic to protect ourselves, but also to protect others. And that sets an example that reduces the stigma of wearing a mask and makes it, if anything, uncomfortable to not be wearing one. I'd be embarrassed not to have one. If I forget a mask and I go to the bathroom and somebody sees me, I'm terribly embarrassed because indoor mask wearing has become a norm. And in my community, in the grocery stores, this is a relatively conservative community. Everybody obliges that norm. And public health officials have modeled it and urged us to model. Great example of norm formation and the social responsibility norm. Okay, I've got just enough time left to share with you one other thing, which is sort of a personal passion of mine. Stephen mentioned in introducing me that I'm a person with hearing loss and an advocate for people with hearing loss in the United States with whom I'm networked. This is a challenging time for us, but not just for us, because teaching in a face mask world is a challenge for some students and certainly for some teachers. And I'm going to be curious to know if it's true for any of you. First of all, the masks absorbs a certain amount of sound, and so there's some reduced acoustic clarity. Second, we're deprived of facial expressions and what they communicate, because they're part of the communication of emotion and information, including natural lip reading. And if you think of the McGurk effect, which is a wonderful demonstration of the importance of reading lips for understanding speech, we're deprived of that now. There is indeed so much more to hearing than meets the ears, and so much of that is cut off by mask wearing. And thus I could sympathize with President Trump when he asked a reporter to take off the mask because I cannot hear you, referencing they're wearing the face mask. I've noticed in watching some sports over the Christmas holidays, the number of coaches of basketball and football teams who oblige the norm of wearing a mask, but then when they want to yell at their players or referee, understand that that mask is impeding their being heard. And so they, at the worst possible time, violate the very purpose of the mask by pulling it off so they can talk to somebody and be heard. they're at least recognizing the phenomenon I'm talking about. I mean, this is bad behavior, but at least it's recognizing the fact that that masks impede with communication. Have you had any of these experiences, such as my colleagues report? I found myself asking students to repeat their questions. I'm using my outside voice in this masked world, which takes more energy. And some of my colleagues have reported this leaves them more drained. And we're talking about, of course, in-class, face-to-face teaching. It's frustrating to continue to ask a student to repeat something, and I fear it will shut down discussion and make my classes into a lecture performance, in which case I might as well just go online. I cannot call, this is the beginning of the semester, have trouble calling on a familiar student by name because I can't tell who anyone is because face recognition is impeded. Well, in response to that, there are some things we can do to increase hearing accessibility. Obviously, if we're wearing a mask, we can prioritize clarity in our speech, but it's difficult to sustain that for any given period of time because once our mind goes back to what we're talking about, we regress, we revert to our natural speaking styles. Some wonderful research, by the way, one of my favorite studies in psychology in which naturally extroverted people were invited to tone it down and simulate a low-key introvert. Well, introverts were asked to amp it up and speak with the energy of an extrovert. And even then, the two groups didn't overlap because we so are what we are. And so we need to do some other things. We need to, if we don't understand, ask people to repeat what they're saying, to be bold and courageous about that. There are transparent face masks available that allow us to read expressions and read lips. And by the way, this is a new German product that I'm told is coming out this spring that is biologically effective in containing the virus, is transparent, but also allows you to breathe a little more easier than does the transparent plastic. We can add more PA systems to our larger classrooms. That helps. We can, I haven't seen this done, but why not? We could put, given the incredible sophistication of today's live captioning, we could put a captioning bar atop the writing boards in classrooms and have that spill out. By the way, as a person with hearing loss, occasionally on Google Meets or other things, I've used live captioning and it is amazingly good. In fact, human captioners are, for these sorts of occasions, being put out of business by this. Or we can install, and this is one of my passions, hearing loops in, as we have on my campus, in all the large auditoriums that take the sound that goes into a microphone and transmits it through a surrounding magnetic wire that communicates with the hearing aid and puts the speakers right inside one's ears rather than on the ceiling. And if you're interested in that, I have a Hope College hosted website, hearingloop.org, that explains this technology. So Stephen asked for 25 to 30 minutes, and that takes us right to the time he suggested. If you're interested in more reflections on these or other topics, there is that blog site that Stephen mentioned, or if you want to sign up with me at Twitter, I'll see to it that you get a little note, a little tweet every time there's a new essay comes out, which is once every couple of weeks, as one did just this morning. So with that, I would be delighted to receive your comments and questions, and I will be available again just for general conversation about anything you'd like to engage in a conversation hour with Doug Bernstein at 5 o'clock.
Thank you, David. Appreciate wonderful talk. Exactly the kind of raised exact kind of issues that we've all been thinking about and we can use to enrich our teaching. I'm sure you haven't been tracking this, but there's wonderful discussions going on in the chat.
I have not been tracking it.
You've raised a lot of interesting issues. So we have a couple people who have been tracking questions in the chat. So we're going to, people are the way we've set up, people can't unmute themselves. So if you have a question, you could put it in the chat, and otherwise I'm going to start with either Beth or Ken. Do you have questions that have come up in the chat that you'd like to pose?
And let me just say before you ask anything, here with 400 fellow teachers and many experts on many different things in this room, I don't consider myself an expert on everything, but rather a generalist. So please feel free, I guess using the chat function, to add your own thoughts on any of the questions voiced, and Beth can, or whomever you, Stephen, can pick up on that.
Mhm. Yeah, and a number of people have already asked because they found it so interesting. I know you sent a copy to me earlier. You're okay with me sharing those?
Absolutely.
Slides?
The slides are my gift to anybody.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that, yeah, we'll have a, excuse me, we'll have a folder we'll make available to participants today that has Dr. Myers and Dr. Alexander's slides, as well as the Teaching Slam presenters slides. And all the videos will be available too on our YouTube channel eventually. So I'll start reading a first question, Ken, and then you could take the next one. How does that sound?
Okay.
This is a question that was early on in your talk, when you were talking about teenagers and their increased well-being in some ways. And
or at least stable well-being.
Right. So Karen Tappy said it would be interesting if the pandemic caused young people to become less interested in electronic communication, having gotten sick of it, and are more interested in face-to-face communication with their peers. And some other participants piled onto that comment. So I'll ask you to respond to that first.
Well, it's just interesting. When we're all vaccinated, there's going to be, as Nicholas Christakis was, I just heard saying the other day, as has happened in similar situations in the past, a real hunger to reconnect with people. Aren't some of you already talking about the dinner parties you're going to have, the friends you're going to have over, the people you're going to go out to restaurants with, the events you're looking forward to going to, reconnecting at worship or at parties or whatever? And so I think there's, with our need to belong having been deprived for so long, there's going to be a real need to reconnect. Our ancestral history has designed us for face-to-face human relationship. And there's controversy over this research, but there's so much, I think, really provocative research that shows that, very simply, since 2010 to the present, social media, time spent on social media has increased as smartphones exploded. During that same 10-year period since 2010, the rate of teen depression and suicide ideation has increased. Now, that's a mere correlation, but John Haidt and Jean Twenge and others are looking at, first of all, the correlation across individuals between social media use and vulnerability to depression and mental health issues. And there is a correlation, but it's especially after you're spending about 3 hours a day on social media that it becomes associated with negative mental health implications. And they're tracking things longitudinally in individuals' lives to see if people increase or decrease their social media use, what effect does that have on their mental health? And finally, there are actual experiments that put people on a social media diet. One large experiment was done by economists with a huge budget that paid people to be randomly assigned to either go on a Facebook diet, cut it out, or not for a period of several weeks, and found the consequences of that. So this is an ongoing field of research, but there's a lot of evidence that social media, as well as sleep or sleep loss, has a lot of effects on people's mental health. But many miles to go before that issue is settled. That's a long answer to that question, but
And just so you know, we've actually just turned on the live transcript for this session now.
And you can see how spectacularly good it is.
Another question comes from Lauren. It says, given the reference to the US, is this sort of unrealistic optimism that we might be experiencing related to individualistic worldviews?
And so are we referring to the optimism about the virus won't hit me because I'm not vulnerable to it? Is that how you read that question?
I think perhaps.
So it's interesting that collectivist countries such as Korea, Japan, China, and Hong Kong as part of China have all been very successful in obliging social norms. And of course, there's a long tradition of mask wearing in those cultures as well. So individualistic countries, albeit with the exception of New Zealand, have been more successful in containing the virus than have more libertarian individualistic countries such as our own, where of course, mask wearing has become unfortunately politicized as a constraint on my liberty without due consideration for the liberty of other people to stay healthy and well. So I think there is a component of individualism here in this, and of libertarian individualism that has contributed to the spread of the virus.
Mm-hmm.
Beth, you know much more about cross-cultural psychology, so feel free to jump in with a comment.
I'm also thinking of a study by my friend Steve Heine that showed that unrealistic optimism in general, this was in the 90s, was lower among Japanese college students.
Oh, yes. Okay. So there is a cultural relationship there.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question that came from, say, the first third of your talk, where you were discussing the risks of COVID exposure and people's awareness of the risks. And Jason Spiegelman asked how the data might look when we parse them out by SES. So he pointed out that those who are the most vulnerable in quote unquote normal times are exponentially more vulnerable during the past many months. And so an increased sense of vulnerability probably plays into many of these trends. So we might ask if you have a comment on that point.
Right. No, so I don't have much to say on that, except that's a very good point. And of course, vulnerability strongly correlates with SES. So people that are in essential occupations as grocery store workers or whatever are much more likely to be in contact than are people who can work from home sitting in front of computer screens, isolated from other people. So SES is a big factor there.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Here's another question from Joan. She was curious to see how infants' facial recognition might be affected by mask wearing in the social world.
Certainly. But of course, infants, fortunately, are mostly home with their caregivers who are not wearing masks at home. So, but certainly infants, like everybody's going to have trouble discerning facial expressions and emotions in a masked world.
Mm-hmm. Here's a comment. There's a long discussion in the chat, and it's a challenge to keep up with all these amazing comments. I have to apologize to everyone who's put a comment in there or commented. It's, as you know, we need really a Slack channel here. But barring that, I wanted to pull out. Some people are talking about the stresses and also the benefits of online communication and social communication through these tools that we're using. And Bonita Cade said, I've personally reconnected with myself and begun to realize how interacting depletes me and how to some extent I muted the hostility inherent in a number of my environments. Mm-hmm. And she says, I don't know if I'm willing or if she can go back to minimizing the angst involved in a lot of interactions and pretending that microaggressions that she experiences are very real and evident at so very many levels.
So Benita, I think if I read you right, describing yourself as an introvert, somebody for whom being around others drains energy rather than feeds energy into your life. I will relate to that in a different way, in that as a person with hearing loss, I love Zoom and this headset. I can hear everybody in the room here, all 380 of you, crystal clear. I love being at the trade winds down in Florida, and I hope to be there again someday. But when somebody speaks from the other side of the room down there, that's much more of a challenge for me than on Zoom here, where accessibility is not an issue. I'd still rather be face to face and be able to give you and Stephen a pat on the back for what you're doing here.
Here's a question from Lauren. She says, there's so much research out there that supports and discounts mask wearing. How do you balance the different data out there? I wear masks, but I've read pretty decent research that doesn't support wearing it. I've got colleagues that argue against it. So how would you help a person to think through that?
Well, again, I'm not an epidemiologist and I'm not a virologist, so I'm not an expert here. But I think what many of us have come to understand, first of all, is just the physics of how a mask prevents the projection of viral microparticles. Also, as we not only have the scientific rationale for that, but we have the evidence that has come from some situations where people, like one early study that the CDC publicized, where you had 2 hairdressers that both had COVID and were doing beautician work with dozens of clients. Everybody was wearing a mask, and despite their close proximity for a half hour or so, nobody got COVID because of the mask wearing. Plus, we have the correlations that I was just showing you between states and countries where mask wearing is normative. There's much less COVID than in states and places where mask wearing is not normative. And so I think the evidence is, as I've understood it, is just absolutely persuasive. There's just no question about it. Although it wasn't understood at the beginning. Of course, Anthony Fauci, didn't assume that it was at the beginning, as he does now, that it was an important way to control the spread of the virus, and thus to enable us all to get back to work and to school and to go to movies and restaurants and so forth. That's ultimately what we want.
Good. So I'm going to raise a question that was just asked recently, but it was endorsed by several other attendees. This is a question from Carl Bailey. And Carl wrote, Dr. Myers, what are your thoughts on how to counter conspiracy theories in the intro psych classroom without making students feel like they're on a different side? A combative classroom isn't going to foster building interest in psychological science, but I got a few very conspiracy-laden papers and reflections last semester. So I think a lot of us would love to hear your thoughts on that question. So how to counter conspiracy theories in the intro psych classroom.
Right. Again, I'm not a particular expert here, but I would say first, just we want to build a foundation in critical thinking, in appreciating what you and your research methods course and text teach, Beth, the importance of evidence-based thinking and learning how to evaluate competing claims. People have all sorts of ideas that are demonstrably false. For example, every year, 7 in 10 Americans tell Gallup that the crime rate has increased over what it was the year before. And they've been saying this for years, even though the crime rate has actually plunged from 1993 to the present by just dramatically. And so what people perceive is the reality is the opposite of reality. Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness, that I showed you from illustrations, some illustrations from, also has case after case of what people believe. Most, I think, as I recall, the average person believes that about 38% of the world's children are vaccinated, when in fact 88% are vaccinated. Well, I wonder if, first of all, we could teach scientific thinking, how we can think smarter about all sorts of things in everyday life. And that's why the teaching of research methods, both in your course and in Stephen's course, and also in Intro to Psych, is important. And then I think we can teach particular examples of such as what I've just given that illustrate that. Thirdly, there's actually some very good research on conspiracy thinking. Who are the people that come up with conspiracy theories? How do they form them? How does social isolation and group polarization, as people of like minds isolate themselves from contrary views and from dissonant opinions, how does that enable the process of polarization that takes us both rightwards into conspiracy thinking, but also potentially to the extreme, in an extreme left direction? And in fact, my blog post at talkpsych.com that was just posted today is about the polarization process, which is where I cut my eye teeth in social psychology. So that you could go to today's blog to get a partial answer to that question. Great question. These are all super questions.
And I'll just point out that several folks have just put some of their own resources online that they know of that they use. So, so thank you for doing that. I think we may have time for one more question. Does that seem right, Steve and Ken?
Yeah, we're 1:48, so one more question, then I'll see if Dave needs a break or if he wants to go for a few more minutes.
This is great fun, but I know people may need a break before they sign on. They have to get off and then sign on to the next group, and I don't want to. I want to make things good for the next people.
Okay, we don't want to take
And I'm also available at 5 o'clock for just general conversation with Doug Bernstein.
All right, so let's have one more question, and then there may be some people might want to take a break, but then we'll definitely stop a few minutes before 2 to queue up the next session and get everyone on board with that. Okay, so Beth, another question or two then.
Yeah, this is Ken's. It's Ken's turn.
Okay, Ken.
Oh, let's see.
I was thinking the UDL question.
Yeah, so this question talks about, it says that being forced to go online has really pushed a lot of us to start exploring technology that will make our courses much more accessible. Additionally, it's pushed the tech to adapt very quickly. It seems that this might be a silver lining to the pandemic. Any thoughts about that?
I have no more expertise and in fact less expertise than many of you, beyond saying that what we've learned to do in this zoomed world of online education is probably going to have some carryover into hybrid learning in the semesters and years to come. And in meetings too, in campus meetings, and in the amount of travel we do to have meetings, because we've learned there are alternative ways of doing things, and that's some upside to this. At the same time, I think we've also learned and been reminded of the importance of connection and the importance of physical closeness. One of the unfortunate aspects of the distance classrooms on my campus, which take 30 students and put them in a room that used to hold 60 and have all the chairs as far apart as possible within that room in order to maintain 6-foot distance between each student, is it creates the opposite of a social facilitation effect. Social facilitation research has shown us that a good house is a full, crowded house. And so when teaching introductory or social psychology to 35 students in a room that had 40 chairs, and I would expect maybe 32 students to show up, I would get there early, get rid of 8 chairs, stack them in the back, move the chairs in tightly together in like 2 or 3 semicircles, and then every seat was occupied. Everybody was close to everybody else. That's a good house, theatrically speaking. That's a house where jokes are funnier. That's a house where there's more energy in teaching. And so I look forward to the day when we can get back to that, when we have the opposite of the distance classroom, the distance education. So to summarize, I think we've learned some things from online education that we can carry into hybrid learning in the future. But I also hunger for us, again, to have in-person, socially close classrooms. And by the way, when that time comes, I encourage you to get rid of the extra chairs in your classrooms, and to meet your students close together, and to feel a sense of community and energy that can come with physical proximity. So thank you all for allowing me to be your guest. I'm greatly honored. And again, I'd be happy to hear from any of you if you have any questions, either at 5 o'clock or by email afterwards. And thank you for the invitation, Stephen and organizing committee.